welcome to the very first episode of Pete's Podcast here on iTunes, SoundCloud, and YouTube. And if it's not available on two of those three places, it's at least available on one right now while we figure this whole thing out. And wherever you're listening to me right now, that's where we're at. Thanks for joining me here for episode number 1 of Pete's Podcast. My name is Peter Czymbor. I will be your host. Today's special guest will be ESPN Friday Night Fights in-studio host Todd Grisham. Todd Grisham, also a former WWE announcer, so we'll chat with him about matters as they relate to boxing, combat sports, and professional wrestling, and sometimes how they merge and intertwine with one another. We'll touch upon former WWE wrestler CM Punk. As it turns out this year, he will be competing in his first ever mixed martial arts bout under the umbrella of the UFC, the biggest mixed martial arts promotion in the entire world. This interview with Todd Grisham was recorded this past Friday at around 5:30, 5:45 in the afternoon Eastern Time at the Turning Stone Casino in Verona, New York, which was the site of the most recent edition of ESPN's Friday Night Fights. That's where Todd Grisham and myself met up. I mention the time and place of where we recorded this interview because it will explain why a rather large subject in the world of boxing and sports in general does not come up during the course of this interview. At around 6 p.m. on Friday, Floyd Mayweather announced via a social media platform that finally, after 5 years of mostly failed but ultimately successful negotiations, Floyd Mayweather will be fighting Manny Pacquiao May 2nd at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas. This is a fight that fight fans have wanted to see for about 5 years, casual sports fans have wanted to see for about 5 years, and people who really know nothing about sports but just know something about pop culture in general have known is a big deal for about the past 5 years. May 2nd, it's finally happening. Floyd Mayweather will be taking on Manny Pacquiao in Las Vegas. That is the big news in the world of boxing coming out over the course of the past few days, but it was announced actually while I was recording this interview with Todd Grisham, and I did not know that the fight was made official until after we had finished recording the interview. Therefore, you will not hear me ask Todd Grisham, "Hey Todd, what do you think about the fact that Floyd Mayweather and Manny Pacquiao are finally fighting May 2nd? Not going to happen. So if you're scratching your head and wondering why I don't ask that at the end of this interview, well, I'm just giving you a little bit of foresight that it's not going to happen. Anyways, you're listening to Pete's Podcast here on iTunes, SoundCloud, and YouTube. And now, without further ado, here's my interview from this past Friday with ESPN Friday Night Fights studio announcer, Mr. Todd Grisham. We're coming to you from the Turning Stone Casino in Verona, New York. You're listening to Pete's Podcast here, available on YouTube, SoundCloud, and iTunes. And joining me now for my very first proper interview on Pete's Podcast, former WWE announcer, now studio host of ESPN's Friday Night Fights, Mr. Todd Grisham. Todd, thank you so much for joining me for the first proper interview of Pete's Podcast, episode 1, my friend.
I appreciate you having me on. I don't know how proper it's going to be. We'll see how this thing plays out, but again, thanks.
You know, you're interesting to me in that you're a recent development in sports media that guys can transition from WWE into, for lack of a better term, legitimate sports broadcasting and can do so seamlessly. You've done it. Jonathan Coachman has done it. You wouldn't have seen Mean Gene Okerlund, calling football in the 80s and 90s. Was that ever something that was in the back of your mind as you made the jump from WWE to ESPN?
Not really. Like Jonathan Coachman, I started out in regular sports, quote unquote. I started out doing sports radio, calling high school football games. I got a TV job in Iowa for 3 years. I went to Tucson, covered the Arizona Wildcats, covered the Diamondbacks, did that for 4 years. I also worked at Fox Soccer Channel for 4 years. So WWE was actually the biggest difference in my career as far as changing up. So once I got out of WWE, it was like getting right back on the horse again. It wasn't a big transition for me at all.
How did the WWE gig come about? Was it just a natural progression in your sports broadcasting career, or were you a fan of that genre growing up?
Like everybody says, I loved it when I was a kid. Ultimate Warrior was my guy. Macho Man Randy Savage was my favorite. Oh, yeah, you should do this all the time. But I hadn't watched it in years, and I was working in Tucson, and a friend of mine who was a quasi-agent said, hey, man, he knew I was kind of looking to move up and on. Said, WWE has a position open. You should apply for it. And I said, hey, if you want to send it in for me, go for it. Sure. And he sent it in, and I didn't hear anything for 6 months. And they called me and said, hey, we got your stuff. And I didn't even remember him sending in. That's how long it had been. And it was a Friday, and they said, can you be in New York City for an audition on Monday? 3 days. So I said, sure. So I just crammed and watched SmackDown on the internet and Raw and tried to get up on all the storylines and went out there and did the audition, and they hired me.
I have a similar story, not quite with the ending that yours had, but a friend of mine said one time they're looking for announcers for a company called ROH. You should try. I sent them some fights that I had broadcasted in the mixed martial arts world and boxing world. I'd never done anything wrestling. Though, like you, I grew up imitating Macho Man Randy Savage as well. I broke my collarbone imitating Macho Man Randy Savage, as a matter of fact, when I was a toddler. In the back of my mind, I was thinking, I wonder if I did this, if it would ever hurt me going into, legitimate sports broadcasting. But then again, ROH and WWE, certainly one's minor league and one's the big leagues.
Well, there's still I don't know if the word's a faction, which is a good wrestling term, that still thinks and equates professional wrestling almost to pornography. They hear you work at WWE and they don't think how hard it is, and it's broadcasting. You got 20,000 people at every show, and you're on 180 countries. They just think, oh, that's that fake garbage television. I'd never hire someone like that. So you got to get over that stigma. But thankfully, ESPN didn't view me that way and allowed me to just come in. They gave me an audition, and they saw me for what I was, and thankfully hired me.
What has been the biggest difference from your time working in WWE and now working at ESPN, if there were really any?
Well, the main one is Vince McMahon isn't screaming in your ear.
How brutal is that? Because it does get out there. It's fairly legendary.
He knows what he wants, and sometimes you don't know what he wants, and he makes it very clear what he wants. And it doesn't matter what you're doing, what you're saying, what's happening. He'll tell it to you when he wants to tell it to you and how he wants to tell it to you. And, hey, it's his show. I'm doing what he wants me to do. I'm his employee. And after a while, I wouldn't say you get used to it, but you learn how to deal with it.
Once again, we're chatting with Todd Grisham, former WWE announcer, now ESPN Friday Night Fight studio host. We're at the Turning Stone Casino in Vernon, New York. Let's talk about someone else who's trying to make the transition from sports entertainment, if you will, to sports. You, of course, started in sports, went to sports entertainment. Now you're back. Let's talk about CM Punk a little bit. Made some headlines recently when it came to fruition that he is going to be competing in the Ultimate Fighting Championship. Now, first off, from a competitive standpoint for CM Punk, is that a good idea? And from a business standpoint for the UFC, is that a good idea? Because it's going to attract a lot of attention, but is it the right type of attention?
When you say business, to me, business is about making money and expanding your business. And I don't see how CM Punk going to the UFC is not a good business decision. I mean, tell me on what level. Will the hardcore fans be against it? Maybe, but they're hardcore fans. They're going to be there no matter what you do. When Brock came over, half the fans said, oh, this is stupid, it's ridiculous, he's a professional wrestling guy. And soon enough, he was a heavyweight champion of the world over there. So I think from a business perspective, it's fantastic. As for CM Punk personally, he wants to do it. He thinks eventually he can be good enough to do it. And the good thing about the UFC is we're going to find out whether he's legit or not in about 1 minute into his first fight.
I'm not saying I disagree with you. Let me play devil's advocate for a moment. How can it be a bad thing? CM Punk has no combat sports background of any kind, whereas Brock Lesnar was a former NCAA heavyweight national championship. So he had that pedigree to go off of. CM Punk jumping from WWE directly into the UFC without having any amateur fights or maybe fighting on the regional circuit, does it at all diminish the UFC brand that a guy with really nothing to go off of other than his name in another form of entertainment is competing for them, as opposed to someone who works their way up?
I mean, when you say diminish the brand, who are you talking about diminishing it to? Like I said, Kimbo Slice came out and had that fight card on CBS. They got the biggest rating ever. It was huge. So now if CM Punk goes over there and lays an egg and gets blown out in his first fight and we never see or hear from him again, then I don't think it diminishes anything. Now if he sucks and gets pounded and then they bring him back 3 months later and gets pounded again and they keep putting him on pay-per-view cards, then yes, it might diminish in your product. But I don't think they're going to do that. They're going to play it smart. The biggest money they'll ever make out of him is his first fight, and I think we all know that.
How well did you know CM Punk from your time working in WWE, and did it surprise you that he decided to venture directly into the UFC, which is the highest form of mixed martial arts that there is nationally and worldwide?
I know him pretty well. I mean, mostly from a work standpoint. You know, when you travel 51 weeks a year with somebody, you run into him, you talk to him. I got to interview him at a UFC event a couple weeks ago, and I hadn't seen him in about 2 years. And he came up to me, and we hugged and stuff. Hey, what's up, man? And then when I started my interview, I said, this is the first time I've ever interviewed CM Punk when he doesn't know the questions and I don't know the answers. So it was a little foreign in that regard, but I don't know if I'd say we're best friends. I'm sure he wouldn't say that anyway, but we're acquaintances, and we get along great.
Were you surprised that he decided to leave WWE in the fashion that he did? Because it's very odd that someone would leave WWE and would actually get mainstream attention the way his departure did.
You know, a lot of guys have left. Almost everybody's left WWE. Hulk Hogan left WWE. Batista left WWE. Stone Cold Steve Austin left WWE. So everybody leaves. Are they going to come back? Punk says he's not coming back. Do you believe him? That's up to you. But he's kind of always been a renegade, you know, even if it's a weird renegade. He doesn't drink, he doesn't smoke. In that lifestyle, a lot of people drink and smoke, and he doesn't do it. So to me, that's being a renegade. Did I ever think he'd fight in the UFC? It never crossed my mind to even think about it. I know when we call his fights, and I talked to him before his fights, WWE, he would always tell me about training in jiu-jitsu and training in his striking ability and doing a lot of pad work. So I know he always trained in it and enjoyed doing it. I never knew how good he truly was at it, but we're all going to find out.
Let's talk about the current season of ESPN's Friday Night Fights, which you're a part of as the studio host. ESPN, for the second year in a row, is conducting its Boxino tournament, where 2 8-man tournaments across 2 respective weight divisions. This was a tournament that started 15 years ago, went away for 15 years, was brought back last year, and brought back for the second year in a row. A big fan of the tournament format as the season of ESPN Friday Night Fights progresses?
Yeah, I love it. You know, it's great because, for better or worse, for the most part, ESPN Friday Night Fights, we showcase lesser talent or talent that's on the way up that you may not know a whole lot about. And with Boxino, we're still doing that. But by the end of the tournament, if you win it, you're a known guy. You're a Willie Monroe Jr. where people are thinking, hey, this guy might deserve a title shot. You're a Peter Petroff who could be thrown in with anybody right now, and they'd say it'd be a tough out. So to me, it's the best of both worlds. It's compelling television. You get a chance to learn about these guys, learn about their background. I wouldn't say fall in love with them, but learn enough about them to care. And that's kind of what, you know, WWE was all about. My storytelling job is for you to care about what happens in the ring, even though it's, you know, predetermined. And here it's the same way. If it's 2 guys just fighting in a barn somewhere, you're like, oh, whatever. But if there's a big storyline and you have a reason to care about one guy or the other or both, it's that much better.
I like the fact that you get a mix in the tournament of guys who are on their way up, as you mentioned, guys who maybe at best have been considered club fighters to this point, but they get this opportunity within the mix of 8 guys within their weight division. Then you get some other guys who maybe have had their chances, not lived up to the hype, and they're going to get what might be the final chance of their career, like Jason Estrada, who we'll see fight tonight. Of course, the result will be known by the time this interview posts, but it's just a nice mix of guys from various levels.
Yeah, to me, the most intriguing character, at least in the heavyweight division of Boxino, is Donovan Dennis, because I know Banner Promotions is really high on him. He suffered a 1-punch knockout to Nate Heaven, who's also in the Boxino tournament. But Donovan Dennis, by everything I've heard, is hopefully a title contender somewhere down the line. So he's got a chance to really prove it in this tournament. If he can beat Estrada and all those guys on the way to win, then all of a sudden he's beaten a few somewhat named guys, and he can jump in there with a Jennings or, you know, some of those maybe B-plus level guys. So I'd love to see what he's going to do.
And it's interesting, the heavyweight division right now on a worldwide scale, you've got Vladimir Klitschko, he's the man. Deontay Wilder has a title belt. That's the money fight if it ever does come to fruition within the heavyweight division. But below them, there's a really wide gap. It's really open for anyone to get that shot, make the most of it in terms of a payday, and make the most of the opportunity in maybe winning a title at some point.
Yeah, you know, Deontay Wilder is such a breath of fresh air. Even if he gets exposed down the line by Klitschko, we got hope. You know what I mean? There's somebody out there that we see that, hey, he can legitimately give Vladimir a run for his money. Well, at least we think he can. Even with Tyson Fury, at least in my estimation, he'd get blown out by Klitschko. But, you know, Deontay, to me, he's a great talker. He's a good-looking kid. He seems to want to face the best. He hasn't yet, but he wants to. And the sky's the limit for him. So I think the heavyweight division is finally interesting again.
And he's been criticized at times for the way in which he was handled coming up through the professional ranks. He was a 2008 Olympics bronze medalist, but what I think a lot of people don't realize was that was amazing that he even got to that level as an amateur, considering how little amateur experience he had. It seems like every time the moment has been there to strike thus far for him professionally, whether it be to fight a former title holder, Sergei Liakovic, to take that step up and fight a title holder, Bermane Stiverne, it's just been perfect timing that his team has brought him up with. And while he probably will have a few more fights before he gets the Klitschko fight, if it ever does happen, it seems like everything they've done so far, they've just done so right from a timing perspective.
Yeah, everyone criticized him before that Bermane-Stiverne fight, and that's why it was must-see TV for me, because it was, hey, is he legit? Can he fight somebody like Bermane-Stiverne and win? Can he go 12 rounds? He'd never been past, what, was it 4 rounds up into that? So he proved a lot to me, and I know he proved a lot to Stiverne and to a lot of boxing so-called experts, but he hasn't certainly proven it all. Is he among the elite best in the world? You know, top 10 for sure, maybe top 5, but we'll see what happens when he fights a couple of big guns.
And a lot of us thought that he might have been nothing more than a strong right hand. Well, he showed us he could box as well against Stiverne. Let's talk about the landscape of the boxing business. Deontay Wilder is handled by an advisor, manager, some would say promoter, though I don't think anywhere on record, named Al Haymon, who is making a lot of moves and a lot of headway in getting boxing back on national TV and getting its presence on basic cable television outside of ESPN, which is pretty much where it's resided the past 15 years at that level. He's buying time on NBC, Spike TV, CBS Sports Network, and a few other places as well. What are your thoughts on what Al Haymon is doing to the boxing business? It almost seems like what Vince McMahon did in the 80s with wrestling.
To me, the jury's out. You know, I don't know what is it good, is it bad? Who knows? It can be very, very good. It can be very, very bad. It just depends on what he wants to do. If he really wanted to make it like boxing's version of the UFC, which I think everyone could agree would be a good thing, then I'm all for it. But who knows what's going to happen?
It's a double-edged sword. It would be a great thing for the fans in that if all the fighters are fighting under one umbrella, they're going to make the matchups that people want to see. At the same time, guys might not have anywhere else to go to make as much money as they would under the Haymon umbrella, but I'm sure the top ranks and the Bob Arams aren't going anywhere for the foreseeable future.
Right. Again, I think the main thing that hopefully Al Haymon can stress to his guys is a loss isn't the end of the world. You know, in the UFC, some of the most popular fighters have 3, 4, 5 losses. Some of the champions have lost 6, 7 times. So if he can put guys head-to-head matchups, bigger names, and say, look, if you lose, no big deal. I'll give you another shot in 3 or 4 fights if you win. If he can get that kind of mentality and make those kind of matchups, it's going to be great.
And I agree with you wholeheartedly. This Floyd Mayweather way of developing has gotten in a lot of fighters' head that loss will kill you. Paulie Malignaggi, for example, does anyone care that 8, 9 years ago he got his ass beaten by Miguel Cotto? No, he learned from the experience and got better and won a world title because of it.
Arturo Gatti, Mickey Ward, do you even know what their records are? Who cares? If I told you right now we could have, you know, God rest his soul, Arturo Gatti, but we could have them fight for a 4th time, would you be like, well, no, because Gotti's lost too many fights? No one cares. That's the thing. The only people that care about undefeated records are people like Floyd Mayweather and some of the executives at some of the power-playing networks that think, oh, you know, fans want to root for or cheer against a guy that's unbeaten, which is somewhat true. Just as many people probably buy a Floyd Mayweather pay-per-view to see him lose as they do win. But in my estimation, and if it plays out right, where guys don't really care so much about the record as they do being the type of fighter that people want to see, then that's great.
You can be 20-0 fighting body bags or 15-5 fighting stiff opposition. I'll take the 15-5 guy over the 20-0 guy any day of the week. While we're on the topic of Al Haymon, there's been some rumors that he might be buying time with ESPN. How would that affect Friday night fights if that were to come to fruition, and do you have any knowledge of that?
You know, I hear things just like you do, but nothing's been set in stone, nothing's signed. I don't know how it would affect anything. As far as I know, we've got a schedule the next few months that we have fights scheduled for. Obviously, Boxino, you're here tonight, so I'm just going to do that until they tell me something different.
Few rapid fire, put it on the table question before I let you go. Somewhat rapid fire. If you have any anecdote to share, we want to hear it. You do the in-studio hosting for Friday Night Fights. You also do the play-by-play, blow-by-blow announcing from time to time. Play-by-play or in-studio hosting, what do you prefer?
Play-by-play by far. Just being able to not know what you're going to say next and feed off the crowd and, you know, try and convey the storylines of what's happening in the ring to the fans at home. Nothing beats it.
Pro wrestling or pro boxing?
To watch, to call, what?
To watch and to call.
I would say, well, it obviously depends on the fight. The one thing I will say about WWE, when you go to the show, it's going to be a great show if you're into wrestling. Boxing, yes, you can have a great fight. You can also have a stinker. But if you told me it's going to be a great boxing fight versus a WrestleMania main event, I'll go with the boxing.
Compare and contrast Vince McMahon, Dana White, and Al Haymon from your knowledge and experiences with all three.
I don't even know if Al Haymon's a real person, so I don't know if I can talk about him. Dana White, I've interviewed him several times. Very open, very honest. Vince McMahon, a little more guarded, a little untrusting. You kind of got to get into his inner circle to really know what's on his mind. But they're both very good at what they do. Very, very good promoters. There's not too many guys in the world better.
I asked this question having, as recently as 1 week ago, having to go to YouTube to prove to a friend of mine that this actually happened. There was a segment in WWE a number of years ago where Triple H put on a Kane mask, dressed up like Kane, and then proceeded to fornicate with a corpse inside a casket. With that in mind, saying that happened, what's the most ridiculous WWE segment that you were ever forced to partake in that you wish you could take back? Because when WWE is good, it's good. But when it's that, it's head-scratching and cringeworthy.
Geez, there's been so many. I know I get a tweet about every third day of there's this little GIF of me laying in this bed, which looks like I'm naked under these covers. And basically the gist was, from what I remember, it was sort of like win a Valentine's date with your favorite WWE superstar, and it was like Randy Orton, John Cena, or announcer Todd Grisham, and they cut to a shot of me laying in bed, kind of like, oh yeah, you won it. And I wish I could have that back. It's just so stupid, and people ask me about it all the time, and that's pretty ridiculous.
It wasn't in your reel you sent to ESPN, I take it?
No, I wish it'd burn up and be gone forever.
Now, I asked you pro wrestling or pro boxing a few minutes ago. You said earlier off the air that you're actually a soccer guy. What kid who grew up in Alabama in the United States of America became a soccer guy?
I don't know. And my favorite baseball team growing up was the Montreal Expos, which I could never see on TV. I just liked their color. I liked the fact that the city spoke French. I was just a weird kid. But I did spend some time in Richmond, Virginia from the ages of 4 to 7, I think. And I watched my brother play soccer when he was 6 and I was 4. And my mom said I ran up and down the sidelines and couldn't even contain me. So finally they signed me up for the 6-year-old soccer when I was 5. In my first game, I scored 4 goals. So it was like this soccer prodigy. I was unbelievably good when I was like a little kid. And then I moved to Alabama where there was hardly any soccer, and my skills diminished a little bit. But I ended up going to college on a soccer scholarship. I played for the Alabama State development team, so I was one of the top 18 players in the state of Alabama, which isn't saying much because it is Alabama. But I just always loved the sport and still do.
Todd Grisham, he is proof that all you 20-somethings at random TV stations in the middle of Iowa can someday make it to ESPN. Todd, thank you so much for your time. Any final words for our listeners before I let you go?
I usually, someone asked me one time what my favorite quote is, and it's, everyone wants to save the world, but no one wants to help mom do the dishes. So take that for what it is. Do all the little things no one even wants you to do or you don't want to do. That's how you're going to get somewhere. Don't shoot for the stars. You got to climb the little steps first. How's that? Is that good enough? Are you motivated?
I'm going to go help my mom do dishes as soon as I get home. Todd Grisham, thank you.
No problem.
Hey, Mom. Yeah, it's me, Pete. Hey, how are the dishes at your house? Yeah, the dishes. They're in the dishwashing machine? Do you need any help cleaning them? No, the dishwashing machine generally does that itself? Okay, do you need any help putting them in the dishwasher or taking them out? You good? You sure? Yeah, I was talking to this guy named Todd Grisham. Just thought this would be a good idea to give you a call. All right, I'll talk to you later. Thanks. Sorry about that. Had to get off the phone with my mom. Thank you so much to Mr. Todd Grisham for joining me for the very first ever episode of Pete's Podcast. Make sure you check back frequently for more and more episodes of Pete's Podcast. You know, having a guest from the world of both boxing and pro wrestling as my very first podcast guest, I think was a pretty good idea because those are two worlds where podcasts are sort of becoming a part of the culture. If you're a boxing fan, there's a great podcast out there that is actually a subscription-based podcast, so there's a little bit of a fee involved, but if you Google it, you can find it. It's well worth a listen if you're heavily into boxing. It's called Ring Theory, hosted by Eric Raskin and Bill Detloff, both former writers with Ring Magazine. Years ago, I had a pay-per-view video streaming website called anysportstv.com, and we had the pay-per-view worldwide rights to a fight featuring former WBC heavyweight champion Oleg Muskayev taking on the unheralded Nagy Aguilera from Sacramento, California. And ultimately in that fight, Nagy Aguilera knocked out Oleg Muskayev within one round in a fight where Oleg Muskayev didn't even throw a punch. Anyways, leading up to the build-up of this pay-per-view, if you want to call it that, it was the early days of internet pay-per-view, I remember that Bill Detloff, then of Ring Magazine, now of the Ring Theory podcast, which you can find online, wrote something to the effect of he would rather watch Kelly Osbourne vomiting on animals than watch this pay-per-view or something like that. I forget exactly what the description was, but I could tell that he meticulously described how much he did not want to watch this internet pay-per-view so well linguistically that I've always been a fan, even though he was insulting something that directly was making me money. But nevertheless, fan of their podcast, Ring Theory, is available online. I think it's on Podbean, but if you do a Google, you can find it nevertheless. Brad Cooney of 8countnews.com. This week on his podcast, he's going to be chatting with, of all people, Rosie Perez from The View, and also from movies like White Men Can't Jump. He's going to be talking with her about boxing. She's a huge fight fan. If you didn't know that, she will be on Twitter tweeting about obscure six-round undercard fights at major cards that pretty much everyone else will forget about the next day. Rosie Perez is tweeting about them as if they're as big and popular as Floyd Mayweather and Manny Pacquiao. So she'll join Brad Cooney on his podcast later on this week at 8countnews.com. The world of pro wrestling has so many podcasts, I don't even know where to begin. Why don't I begin with maybe the biggest pro wrestling star of the past 20 years? Stone Cold Steve Austin has two podcasts. The Stone Cold Steve Austin podcast and the Steve Austin Unleashed podcast, both available at podcast1.com. Pretty much interviews a collection of wrestlers and entertainers. One is a clean version of his show, the other the Unleashed version. He might throw out some four-letter words, and he'll throw out the big ones too. C-bombs, F-bombs. Steve Austin doesn't care. Also in the world of wrestling podcasts, Roddy Piper has a podcast. Chris Jericho has a podcast. Did a great interview recently with Kiss lead singer and guitarist Paul Stanley that I highly recommend you listen to. And perhaps the greatest play-by-play announcer in the history of pro wrestling, Jim Ross, has a podcast that premieres once a week, and he actually did a very fascinating podcast a few months back that I listened to with Sean Grande, who is the play-by-play radio announcer for the Boston Celtics. And I am based in Boston myself, so the fact that it was the Boston Celtics announcer being interviewed by the greatest wrestling announcer of all time, and they talked about wrestling and how it intertwines with sports. It was quite interesting. You might want to go back in the archives and find that. And I also think Ric Flair and Taz either have or are starting podcasts soon. So for my first podcast, Todd Grisham was the perfect guest to have, and I thank Todd so much for doing it. Thank you so much to you as well for listening to episode 1 of Pete's Podcast. Remember, find me each and every Tuesday here on the World Wide Web. We'll be unleashing new episodes of Pete's Podcast. You can also follow me on Twitter at Peter Czymbor. We'll be providing you with many updates on when and where you can find these podcasts, as well as anything else that I find amusing at that particular time. I decide to type in 140 characters or less and hit the tweet button. That's going to do it for me today. However, I will see you next time. My special guest next week, to be announced. I don't want to tell you who it is until it's already been recorded, but make sure you follow me on Twitter. I'll let you know. Until then, take care. Thank you.